Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone, is a name that has become synonymous with organized crime in America. Born to Italian immigrants in Brooklyn, New York in 1899, Capone rose to infamy as the most powerful and feared gangster of his time. His reign during the Prohibition era left an indelible mark on American history, symbolizing the lawlessness and corruption of the 1920s. This video dives into the life of Al Capone, tracing his journey from a troubled youth in Brooklyn to the kingpin of the Chicago underworld, his ultimate downfall, and his enduring legacy. Al Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Gabriele and Teresa Capone, Italian immigrants from Naples. The Capone family, like many immigrants of the time, settled in a working-class neighborhood where they faced the challenges of adapting to a new country while maintaining their cultural identity. Gabriele worked as a barber, and Teresa was a seamstress, striving to provide for their 9 children. Young Alphonse, or Al, attended school like any other child, but soon found himself at odds with the strict discipline imposed by his teachers. By the 6th grade, he had been expelled for hitting a teacher, a pivotal moment that marked his departure from formal education. The streets of Brooklyn became his new classroom, and it wasn't long before he found himself drawn to the local gangs. Capone's first brush with organized crime came through associations with small-time street gangs, such as the South Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors. However, his real mentor was Johnny Torrio, a prominent figure in the New York underworld. Torrio recognized Capone's potential and took him under his wing, teaching him the business of organized crime. This mentorship laid the foundation for Capone's future in the world of illegal activities. Capone's adolescence was marked by a series of petty crimes and misdemeanors. He worked various odd jobs, including at a candy store and a bowling alley, but his real education came from the streets. Capone quickly learned the importance of loyalty, intimidation, and strategic alliances. His charm and charisma made him popular among his peers, while his willingness to use violence when necessary earned him respect and fear. In 1918, Capone met May Coughlin, an Irish girl who would become his wife. They married on December 30th, 1918, and soon after, their son Albert Francis Sonny Capone was born. Despite his criminal activities, Capone was known to be a devoted family man, and his marriage to May remained a stable aspect of his tumultuous life. In 1919, seeking to escape the escalating violence of New York's gang wars, and at Torrio's invitation, Capone moved to Chicago. Torrio had established himself as a key player in the Chicago underworld, and he needed capable men to help expand his operations. Capone started as a bouncer in Torrio's brothels and quickly proved his worth with his intelligence, ambition, and ruthless efficiency. When Torrio was seriously injured in an assassination attempt in 1925, he decided to retire, leaving Capone in charge of his empire. At just 26 years old, Capone took over a vast criminal enterprise, including gambling, prostitution, and, most lucratively, bootlegging. Prohibition, legal prevention of the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, enacted in 1920 through the Volstead Act, had created an enormous black market for alcohol, and Capone seized this opportunity with both hands. Under Capone's leadership, the Chicago outfit grew exponentially. He employed a mix of bribery, intimidation, and violence to maintain control over the city's illegal alcohol market. He established a network of speakeasies and distilleries, ensuring a steady supply of alcohol to meet the insatiable demand. Capone's influence extended to law enforcement and politics, with many officials on his payroll, allowing his operations to continue with minimal interference. Capone's rise to power was marked by several key strategies and events. He was a master of public relations, often donating to charities and attending public events to cultivate a positive image. He positioned himself as a businessman, providing a necessary service during Prohibition, and many in the public saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood. However, his public persona was a thin veneer over a ruthless and violent criminal operation. One of Capone's most significant challenges was dealing with rival gangs. The Prohibition era saw fierce competition among criminal organizations vying for control of the lucrative bootlegging market. Capone's main rivals included the North Side Gang, led by Bugs Moran, and various smaller outfits. These rivalries often erupted into violent confrontations, with drive-by shootings and bombings becoming common occurrences in Chicago. Capone's strategy for dealing with rivals was a combination of diplomacy and brute force. He sought to negotiate truces and alliances where possible, but he was also unafraid to use violence to eliminate threats. One of the most infamous examples of this was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 members of the North Side Gang were gunned down in a warehouse. Although Capone was widely believed to have orchestrated the massacre, he was never formally charged, and the event remains one of the most notorious episodes in the history of organized crime. The Prohibition era was a time of great opportunity for organized crime, and Capone was its most notorious beneficiary. The demand for alcohol remained high despite the legal ban, and Capone's bootlegging operations met this demand with remarkable efficiency. He orchestrated a complex network of breweries and distilleries, smuggling routes and distribution points, creating an empire that was both highly profitable and fiercely protected. Speakeasies, the illegal bars that flourished during Prohibition, became the primary venues for consuming alcohol. Capone either owned or had influence over hundreds of these establishments across Chicago. His control over the supply chain allowed him to amass enormous wealth, estimated at over $100 million at the height of his power. However, this prosperity came at the cost of countless lives lost in the violent battles that raged between rival gangs vying for control of the lucrative bootlegging market. Capone's bootlegging operations were a marvel of criminal enterprise. He established secret breweries and distilleries throughout the city and its outskirts, ensuring a steady production of alcohol. Smuggling routes were carefully planned, with shipments often concealed in legitimate goods to avoid detection. Capone's network extended from Canada to Florida, and he employed thousands of men to manage the various aspects of his operations. The logistics of distributing illegal alcohol required a high degree of organization and coordination. Capone used a combination of bribery, intimidation, and violence to ensure the loyalty of his subordinates and the compliance of law enforcement and government officials. Judges, police officers, and politicians were regularly paid off to turn a blind eye to his activities, and those who could not be bought were often dealt with through more violent means. Despite his criminal activities, Capone was able to maintain a degree of public support. He was seen by some as a man who provided jobs and entertainment during difficult times. His willingness to engage with the media and present himself as a businessman rather than a gangster helped to create a more palatable image. Capone's charitable acts, such as opening soup kitchens during the Great Depression, further endeared him to the public, even as his violent methods and illegal activities continued unabated. Capone's reach extended beyond mere criminal enterprises. He became a significant figure in the socio-political landscape of Chicago. He maintained relationships with city officials, law enforcement, and even the press, which portrayed him as a sort of Robin Hood figure who provided for the poor and maintained order in the neighborhoods under his control. Capone's ability to manipulate his public image was remarkable. Despite his violent methods, he was seen by some as a necessary evil, a man who brought stability during chaotic times. Capone's economic influence was immense. He owned numerous legitimate businesses, including laundries and milk companies, which he used to launder his illicit earnings. His lavish lifestyle, characterized by expensive suits, jewelry, and high-profile social events, was a stark contrast to the average American struggling through the Great Depression. Capone's power and wealth seemed untouchable, and his name became synonymous with the excesses and corruption of the Prohibition era. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, while solidifying his dominance, also marked the beginning of increased scrutiny from law enforcement and the federal government. The public outcry and pressure from civic leaders forced authorities to take more decisive action against organized crime. President Herbert Hoover, in particular, made it a priority to bring Capone to justice, signaling a shift in the government's approach to tackling gangsters. Capone's influence extended into politics. He had a significant impact on local elections, using his financial power and muscle to ensure that sympathetic candidates were elected to key positions. This political clout provided him with a layer of protection, as those in power were often indebted to him for their positions. Capone's ability to manipulate political processes further entrenched his control over Chicago. The public's fascination with Capone was fueled by his larger-than-life persona. He was a frequent subject of newspaper headlines, and stories about his exploits were often sensationalized. Capone understood the power of the media and used it to his advantage, giving interviews and posing for photographs that portrayed him as a charming and savvy businessman. This media strategy helped to create a myth around Capone, blurring the lines between reality and legend. Despite his outward confidence, Capone was constantly aware of the threats to his power. Rival gangs, law enforcement, and even betrayal from within his own ranks were constant concerns. Capone's paranoia led him to surround himself with bodyguards and to operate from fortified locations. His headquarters, the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, was equipped with hidden passages and secret exits, reflecting his constant need for security. Despite Capone's efforts to shield himself from prosecution through bribery and intimidation, the walls began closing in on him. The creation of a special unit known as the Untouchables, led by Bureau of Prohibition agent Elliot Ness, marked a significant escalation in the efforts to dismantle Capone's operations. Ness and his team, known for their incorruptibility, targeted Capone's bootlegging operations, resulting in significant disruptions and financial losses. However, it wasn't the violent crimes or bootlegging that ultimately brought Capone down, but rather the meticulous work of federal agents who focused on his financial activities. The Treasury Department, under the direction of Frank J. Wilson, painstakingly gathered evidence of tax evasion. Despite his vast wealth, Capone had never filed a legitimate income tax return, an oversight that would prove to be his undoing. In 1931, Capone was indicted on charges of tax evasion and convicted on multiple counts. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a significant victory for law enforcement. The trial and conviction marked the end of Capone's reign over Chicago, and his fall from grace was as dramatic as his rise to power. Capone's trial was a media spectacle. The government's case against him was built on the meticulous work of accountants and investigators who had painstakingly pieced together his financial records. The prosecution presented evidence of Capone's lavish lifestyle, juxtaposed with his minimal declared income, making a compelling case for tax evasion. Despite attempts to bribe jurors and intimidate witnesses, the case proceeded, and Capone was found guilty. Capone's conviction was a major victory for the federal government and marked a turning point in the fight against organized crime. It demonstrated that even the most powerful gangsters could be brought to justice through diligent investigation and the rule of law. The use of tax evasion charges to convict Capone set a precedent that would be used against other criminals in the future. Capone's imprisonment began at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, but due to his continued influence and ability to bribe guards, he was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1934. Alcatraz, known for its isolation and strict regime, was intended to break Capone's connection with his criminal network and prevent him from wielding influence behind bars. Life in Alcatraz was harsh, and Capone's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He had contracted syphilis years earlier, and the disease, untreated for so long, began to take a severe toll on his physical and mental health. Capone spent much of his time in the prison hospital, and by the time he was released in 1939, his mental faculties had significantly declined. Capone's time in Alcatraz was marked by a significant decline in his influence and power. The isolation and strict conditions of the prison effectively cut him off from his criminal empire. He was treated as an ordinary inmate, and his attempts to bribe guards or gain special privileges were met with firm resistance. The once powerful gangster was reduced to a shadow of his former self. During his imprisonment, Capone's health issues became more pronounced. The syphilis that had plagued him for years progressed to neurosyphilis, affecting his brain and causing cognitive decline. Capone's behavior became increasingly erratic, and he spent much of his time in the prison hospital, receiving treatment for his physical and mental ailments. After his release from Alcatraz, Capone was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California to serve the remainder of his sentence. In November 1939, he was released on parole due to his deteriorating health. Capone returned to his estate in Palm Island, Florida, where he spent his remaining years in relative obscurity, far removed from the power and influence he once wielded. Capone's final years were marked by a steep decline in his physical and mental health. He was often described as a shell of his former self, suffering from the effects of syphilis and the long-term stress of his criminal lifestyle. He lived quietly with his family, surrounded by a small circle of loyal friends and associates. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest, brought on by complications from syphilis, marking the end of an era. Al Capone's legacy is a complex one, marked by both infamy and a certain mythologized charm. He is often portrayed in popular culture as the quintessential gangster, a symbol of the roaring 20s and the excesses of prohibition. Films, books, and television series have immortalized his image, blending fact and fiction to create a larger-than-life persona. Capone's impact on organized crime was profound. He transformed the way criminal enterprises were structured, emphasizing the importance of organization, corruption, and diversification of activities. His methods and the scale of his operations set a new standard for organized crime in America. Capone's influence extended to the way law enforcement and the government approached the fight against organized crime, highlighting the need for comprehensive strategies and the use of financial investigations to dismantle criminal networks. Al Capone remains one of the most iconic figures in American history, a symbol of the roaring 20s and the dark underbelly of the Prohibition era. His life story, from his humble beginnings in Brooklyn to his rise as the kingpin of Chicago and eventual downfall, is a testament to the complexities of power, crime, and justice. Through his story, we gain insights into the era he dominated, the societal issues that allowed him to rise, and the relentless efforts to bring him down. His story serves as a window into a transformative period in American history, offering lessons on the impact of social policies, the dynamics of power and corruption, and the enduring fight for justice. Al Capone's rise and fall are not just tales of crime and punishment, but are also narratives that continue to resonate with contemporary issues of law enforcement, organized crime, and the American experience.